Handhelds are hard for me. The chairs are in a V like that with the professor standing here, and there's one chair left right there. So I go up and I sit down, huffing and puffing, sweating and sweating and sweating, but I made it. But all the eyes are focused right here. And all of a sudden, maybe 10 or 15 minutes into the classroom, I notice that every fly in the room is flying around me. Bzzz, a big cloud of flies just flying around. I heard people behind me saying, "Who is this Big Ben?" And I sat there, and I got real still so they'd land, right? But every once in a while, you move a finger, one goes, bzzz, they all go, bzzz. I sat there for 45 minutes with this cloud of flies. I get up, I walk out, it follows me, right? Now, that's funny, right? No, that was not funny. Because I'm not kidding when I say I had a very poor self-image. I really, really looked forward to college. Because in high school, I wasn't popular. And I was really looking forward to college, a new start, where maybe people wouldn't make fun of my speech, where maybe people would accept me. In the first day of college, I started with my self-image just taking a plummet. Friends, there's a place I didn't ask you to look. I said, look back to the death of Jesus. Look ahead to the hope we have in him. Look inside. Examine yourself. Look around where the body of Christ. I wish we had windows here, because there's one place I didn't ask you to look. I'm going to now. Picture yourself looking out there into the world. There are hurting people, friends. There are people that, like me, that wasn't a catastrophe, to be honest. I survived. But there are people with poor self-images. There are people that are hurting. There are people that are struggling with who they are. There are people that need healing. There are people that need hope. And you know what? When we take communion, I think we need to look out there too and say that Jesus that died for me died for the sins of the world. We have a propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. And I wanted to be the one that shared communion today, because I wanted to make that point, that we celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus. But guess what? He didn't die just for us. He died for everybody out there. In October, I shared a message called the Divine Heart Transplant. And when I share this message, I'm not going to go through the whole message, of course, but basically it's that we have sick hearts. And God promises to give us new hearts. And that new heart is his spirit. And he says that I will give you a new heart. But it's a process of transformation. It doesn't take place all at once. There's a time the Spirit of God comes in, I understand that. But there's a process of transformation. And you know, the first time I started seeing this many years ago, it's actually, I'm not preaching to you. This is my life message, the Divine Heart Transplant. The first time I started seeing that God promised to give me a new heart, I kind of just equated it with, oh, so maybe I won't sin. Maybe these things that I struggle with, I just won't do them anymore. And you know what? That's not bad teaching, but it's incomplete. Because what God really wants is me to have a heart like his heart. And we're going to look at one aspect of that today. And we're going to look outside at the world, and we're going to see needy people, and we're going to see the heart of Jesus for these people. And we're going to look in Mark chapter 5. I call this helping and healing the hurting. Helping and healing the hurting. And for the most part, we'll be in Mark chapter 5. I start with verse from chapter 6, verse 34. It says, when he, or Jesus, went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. You know, Jesus looked out. When he looked out over this world, what did he see? He saw people that needed help. He saw people that were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. That's what I want. I want a heart of compassion like that. That is part of the divine heart transplant. That is part of what God wants to do in me. So let me look out over people. You know, Nelp and I, just a week ago, we watched the movie for the second time, Jesus Revolution. I will not get this quote exactly right because I didn't write it down. But at one point, the person who's playing Chuck Smith, doesn't really like the hippies, which generation I came out of, doesn't really like their hair. Some of them were dirty. They didn't have shoes. And he's talking to Lonnie Frisbee. And Lonnie Frisbee says, yeah, but when I look at these people, I see sheep without a shepherd. See, I want to look at people, and I don't want to see, when we're going to talk about this, just homeless people or helpless people or people that are sick or people that are needy. I want to see people like Jesus does. Sheep without a shepherd. Needy people. Needy people. The first ones that I see in Mark chapter 5 is the first 20 verses, actually. And I call this that Jesus helped the homeless. There's a man that Jesus meets who is homeless. It says in verse 2 that there met him a man out of the tombs. In verse 3, he lived among the tombs. In verse 5, he was always crying out and cutting himself day and night among the tombs and on the mountains. This man had no home. And in fact, in the parallel passage of Luke chapter 8, he actually says this man did not have a home. He did not have a home. Friends, when you and I look at the homeless, what do we see? Now, that's a big political question right now, isn't it? What do we do with immigrants coming in illegally, undocumented? I don't care what word you use. And I have my political opinions just like you probably do. And I have my things that we should do and not do just as a country, just like you probably do. But I'm not talking politically right now. I'm talking the heart of Jesus. You know what Jesus sees? Homeless people who need compassion. Whenever I drive in this city and other cities, and there are people on the street begging, don't have a home. If you drive at night, you realize they don't even have a place to go. And you know what? You and I can look at them with eyes that say, well, they deserve it. They've chosen. This is the lifestyle they've chosen. And there's places they could go. And it's their own sin or their own choices that got them here. And you know what? A lot of times we're right. We're not always right, but a lot of times we're right. But I want to ask you something. When Jesus was going to go to the cross, how many of you remember the verse where he said to the Father, now, Father, I'm willing to die for the sins that weren't their fault. I'm willing to die for the ones as long as, it wasn't their fault. But I'm not dying for the ones that they chose. Friends, I'd still be in my sin. By the way, in case you're wondering, no, there's not a verse like that. If Jesus just died and had compassion for things in our life that weren't our fault, we'd all be in trouble. Okay? So I understand saying, well, they made choices. I understand that. I understand saying, well, politically we can only do so much in this society. I'm talking about our hearts right now. Do we have a heart for the homeless? A heart of compassion? Because Jesus did. And this man had an encounter with Jesus. And guess what? In this encounter with Jesus, verse 19 of chapter 5, Jesus says, go home to your friends. This man had an encounter with Jesus, and Jesus provided a way for him to have a home. There's hope for the homeless. But the hope is in Jesus. But we're his body. We have his spirit. Do we have his heart? Then we move on in this day that Jesus had. And I'm going to come back to verses 21 through 24 for a minute. I'm going to start now in verse 25. There was not just a man who was homeless. There was a lady who was helpless. This lady, in fact, I'll read them. Starting in verse 25. There was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. Friends, this lady was helpless. All her money couldn't help her. She spent it all, and she grew worse. All the doctors couldn't help her. She went to doctor after doctor, and she just got worse. 12 years. She was helpless. How do we look at people like this? Do we hope they don't come for prayer? This is after I was a believer, I had a 5-year time period of my life where I had a muscle disorder daily, not daily, hourly, where my muscles were hard as a rock, and it was the most painful thing I could imagine, daily, hourly for 5 years. Jesus healed me from that. But I will tell you, that's the testimony for a different time. But I will tell you something. In those 5 years, I recognize that some people got tired of hearing it. I recognize that some people got tired of, how you doing, Bill? My gritting my teeth through incredible pain. People got tired of it. I had a seminary professor one time who, during the first year I had him, just normal. The second year he came, he had hurt his back somehow, and he was in incredible pain. And he shared, I really respected him for this. He shared one day, he said, I used to judge people who said they had back pain or pain that you couldn't see. You'd ask them to help move. Well, I can't. I have a bad back. And he goes, I used to judge them and think, how long are you going to use that excuse? He goes, I don't judge them anymore. God put compassion in his heart. I will tell you, God did a lot through my 5 years of pain, but one thing he did for me, he gave me compassion for people who have pain and who have physical problems. But guess what? This lady had an encounter with Jesus, right? And then it says this. She was healed of her disease. Verse 29. She had an encounter with Jesus. She was healed of her disease. Friends, there's hope for the helpless, but the hope is Jesus. And you and I are his body. You and I have his spirit. Do we have his heart of compassion? Now, a little aside on this one. In the Vineyard, we believe in healing. And I'll tell you why we believe in it, because it's in the Bible. But we don't see everybody healed. And there are times when I really wonder, am I supposed to be praying for healing or just comforting this person? Last year and a half, I have had a job as a hospice chaplain. John has had the same position, different company, for longer than I've had it. And on a daily basis, I see people who are in the process of dying. And one day, probably about 6 months into that job, I was asking God, am I supposed to be seeing these people and laying my hands on them and anointing and praying for everybody for healing? And I wasn't sure what to say about that. And then I was reading that very day in Matthew chapter 25, where Jesus says he's going to separate the sheep from the goats. And one of the compliments he gives to the sheep, he says, you visited the sick. Friends, I'll be honest with you. Maybe there's a lack of faith, but I can't heal everybody who's sick. But I can visit and do what I can and bring comfort, bring hope. Right? You can't. You can't heal everybody that's sick. You do what you can. I want to illustrate. I want to illustrate that. This is a silly illustration, but I hope it makes sense. Is anybody in this room thirsty? No, but you're thirsty? Okay. Does anybody have any water? Nelfa, you have some water? Nelfa, would you mind giving that to Noble? Well, that was a pretty simple act, wasn't it? But you know what Jesus says? Nelfa, you're going to have a reward for that. You won't lose your reward. Just giving somebody a cup of cold water. Was it cold, Noble? Okay, that's good. You know, in that same passage in Matthew 25, Jesus says you gave water to the thirsty. Friends, I know when I talk about healing, it's easy to think, yeah, but I don't see it happening all the time. Maybe I never see it happen. Guess what? We keep praying by faith, but in the meantime, we do what we can. If it's give somebody a cup of cold water, we do that. If it's visit the sick, we visit the sick. Okay? But you know, I skipped over a passage. Jesus does help and heal the homeless. Jesus does help and heal the helpless. But starting in Mark chapter 5, verse 21, it says, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, the great crowd came about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. His 12-year-old daughter was close to death. And Jesus agreed to go. The lady that was healed, who had 12 years of a disease, interrupted Jesus. Now, if I was that man, although he wasn't, if I was that man, I'd be upset. My daughter's dying, and you're taking time. But it got worse. Because after he healed that lady, verse 35, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Friends, Jesus had concern and compassion for the homeless. Jesus had concern and compassion for the helpless. But he even showed concern and compassion for the hopeless. And if you don't think it's hopeless, let me ask you something. Have you ever known somebody that died? Did you keep praying that they'd be healed? Yeah, in heaven. But you knew on this earth it was done, right? I mean, that's as hopeless as you can get. His 12-year-old daughter died. I'm going to turn this one, because we already talked a little bit about healing. I want to turn this one into a spiritual lesson. How many of you have prayed for years for a loved one to come to know Christ, and it hasn't happened? How many of you have anybody that you've prayed for them and prayed for them and prayed for them, but inside you really think they'll never know the Lord? They are so far from the Lord. They are so hard in their heart. And you feel it's hopeless. It's not. Remember Lazarus? Mary and Martha said, we know you're going to raise him up at the last day. And Jesus said, actually, it takes one word from me and he'll come out of the grave right now. Friends, it's not hopeless when the person you're praying for is very far from the Lord. It takes one word from him and their eyes are open and they come out of that spiritual grave. Don't stop praying for your loved ones. It's not hopeless. When I became a believer in college, And I was in a group called the Navigators, the ones that led me to the Lord. About sometime maybe a year later, I can't remember, two different guys in the Navigators at two different times told me, you know, Bill, we knew you before you were a Christian. I was the long-haired hippie freak, the dope-smoking hippie. My room was the center of parties. I hadn't been to church in 8 years. And these two guys, separate conversations, told me, we knew you before you were a Christian. We thought you'd be the last person on earth to come to Christ. And I didn't say it, but I'll tell you what I thought. I thought, that's why you never shared the gospel with me. You had no hope for my salvation. Friends, this little girl had an encounter with Jesus. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking. Friends, it's never hopeless. I have family members I have prayed for, listen to this, for 50 years. And I feel hopeless at times. I feel like they're so far from the Lord. Friends, it's not hopeless because Jesus has compassion for my family. So Jesus has compassion for the homeless. Jesus has compassion for the helpless. Jesus has compassion for the hopeless. You know, by the way, when I give a message, almost always it's just what God shows me in my time alone with him. And that was a quiet time I had years ago. And then later, I started reading in chapter 6, and I noticed something else. There was a crowd of about 5,000 men, who knows how many women and children, probably 10,000 people, I don't know, who were hungry. And I like words that start with H this morning. And so I noticed that. Jesus had compassion for those who were hungry. In fact, what's really interesting, that passage in Mark chapter 6, it starts in verse 30, is that Jesus tells his disciples, let's get away and rest for a while. Let's get away to a desolate, a lonely place and rest for a while. Jesus saw that his disciples needed to rest. And guess what? They got away, and then this crowd followed them. Now, you know what I would do? I say, wait, this is my Sabbath. This is my time off. I punched out at 5 o'clock. And the disciples remind Jesus of what he said. They tell him, hey, this is a desolate place. Send those people away. And he goes, actually, you give them something to eat. He said, you give them something to eat. A little side lesson there. When you have compassion, you need your rest. Yes, you need your time off. I understand that. But you're really never, ever far from Jesus saying, I want you to serve that person. These hungry people, they had an encounter with Jesus. And guess what? They all ate and were satisfied. Verse 42 of chapter 6. See, the hungry, there's hope for the hungry. But the hope is in Jesus. But we're his body. We have his spirit. Now, I want to circle back to the start of Mark 5 again. Because I emphasized that this man was homeless. But guess what else? Verse 2, this man had an unclean spirit. In fact, if you read on, he had many. He had a legion of unclean spirits. 1 John chapter 5, verse 19 says the whole world is in the power of the evil one. You know, it's been in the news for the last couple of months about hostages, right? You see it almost every night. Friends, this man was a hostage to the enemy. He was a slave. He could not free himself. And in fact, it says he would cut himself That is self-destructive behavior. Kind of reminds me of addictions, where you keep doing the thing that's destructive. And I'm asking how we look at people like that. Well, it's their own fault. There's help available. They're the ones that make the choices. But Jesus never said that to the man. What he said was, get out, legion of demons. This man belongs to me. Friend, how do we look at people who have addictions? You know, one thing that I find very interesting is that the ones we judge are always the ones that have addictions we don't have. Jerry Bridges wrote a book called Respectable Sins. And he talked about how there are certain sins that you don't ever... You know, it's okay to stand in front of a church and say, I struggled with this, but Jesus freed me. That's a great testimony. But the church doesn't like hearing, I'm still struggling. Friends, I still struggle. And I will. Till the day I'm with him. Because this flesh is strong and I give in. How do we look at people with addictions? Do we just judge them and say it's their own fault? And they're by the grace of God. I'm glad, you know, Lord, I go to church every week and I don't do this and this and this. Or do we say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner? This man had an encounter with Jesus. Guess what happened? The townspeople came to Jesus. They saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind. Verse 15. This man had an encounter with Jesus. And he was set free. See, there's hope for the addicted. There's hope for the hostages. There's hope for the demon-possessed. The hope is Jesus. But we're his body. We have his spirit. Do we have his heart? Now, normally, right now, I'd share a conclusion to this message. But God did something this morning, and at the time, I knew that he had done something that he wanted me to incorporate in. I wasn't having my devotional, my time alone with the Lord, to prepare for the message. It was prepared. But God showed me something, and then when John shared his testimony earlier, it was just confirmed. Because this morning, my time alone with the Lord was in Luke chapter 17. Starting in verse 11, Jesus census 10 lepers. And one of them comes back and says, thank you. And that's the normal thing I would dwell on. But not thinking about this message, not knowing anybody's testimony this morning, God pointed out to me that the one who came back was a Samaritan. Friends, Jews hated Samaritans. Now, it's very interesting to me that when there's a community of people who have the same disease, all of a sudden the other 9 accepted him to be with them. But friends, lepers were hated. People were afraid of them. They thought if they touched them, they'd get the disease. People wanted lepers to stay at a distance. Just keep your distance, stay away. But when you add the fact that he was a Samaritan, also hated, friends, these were hated men. But Jesus had compassion on the hated. Jesus had compassion on the homeless. Jesus had compassion on the helpless. Jesus had compassion on the hopeless. Jesus had compassion on the hungry. Jesus had compassion on the hostages. But Jesus had compassion on those who are hated. Are there any groups of people in our world today that are hated? You know, things have changed. I admit, if I had given this years ago, I'd be more bold in saying this. But friends, are there people that we want to keep our distance from? Are there people that we look at and say, you know what? At one time, maybe things have changed, but the homosexual community was like that. The gay community. Jesus wasn't afraid to touch people. Jesus wasn't afraid to be so close, listen to this, so close to sinners that he was called one. He didn't mind that he was so close to the community of drunkards and gluttons that he was called a drunkard and glutton. Friends, Jesus has compassion on those who are hated. Tony Campola tells the story. I read this a long time ago, so I won't get it 100% accurate. But Tony Campola told the story of one time when God led him and his church to have a ministry to the gay community. And some of the people in the church didn't like it. And he got up in the pulpit one day, and he says, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. We start ministering to people like this, and guess what? You come to church and you have to sit by sinners. And he said, but who else are they going to sit by? Jesus has compassion on people that you and I judge. Okay? He does. About 3 days ago, I downloaded a book on my Kindle. It's called Rough Sleepers. It's not a Christian book. It's about a doctor in Boston whose entire career for probably 30 years now has been to the homeless community. It's not a Christian book, but it's about a doctor who graduated from Harvard, and he could have a very high salary and a lot of prestige. And he chose instead to every day go into the homeless community and help to heal the sick. And he's among them. They know his name. They know who he is. Okay? I'm always challenged by stories. This is a true story. It's called Rough Sleepers. It's a true story. I'm always challenged by people who don't, and I'm not judging anybody in this, but by people who don't just give to a ministry, but get involved in people's lives. That's my challenge to myself. That's my challenge to us as the church, to be involved in people's lives. Nelp and I read a book by Preston Sprinkle. See if I remember the name of it, hon. People to be loved. Gay community. Not people to be judged, afraid of, looked down on, kept a distance from, but people to be loved. Those two books, if you don't remember them, ask me later. I'll tell you how to get them. Okay? Let's wrap up with this. Jesus had compassion. I've named all the people he had compassion for. Acts 10, verse 38 says that he went about doing good and healing all those who were oppressed by the devil. But guess what? He's still doing it because we're his body. We have his spirit. But friends, it's not just a matter of saying we'll pray for or give money to. It's a matter of being involved in people's lives. And that's where that compassion will come. Now, I'm going to name one more place that Jesus has compassion, because I do not mean this to be a guilt-producing sermon. It may sound like it at times, but it's not my intention. Friend, no, you can't do everything. I can't do everything. And you know what? That's why I had the illustration earlier of Nelfa giving Noble a bottle of water. If we just had the eyes of compassion to see people's needs and said, God, what can I do? Can I do this little thing? Friends, if you're looking at the world with eyes of compassion, God will show you. The Spirit of God will show you, well, here's what you can do. You know, Nelfa's not the only one that does this, but Nelfa very often will go up to somebody in the store and just say, I'm led to pray for you. What can I pray for you? Okay? We have opportunities every day if we open our eyes and we accept that divine heart transplant that gives us a heart of compassion. We will have opportunities. God will show us. He'll show us every single day. But friends, if you don't have that heart, if you still feel judgmental towards certain people and everything else, let me tell you something. God has compassion for you. Because guess what? King David prayed this, Psalm 51, verse 10, create me a clean heart, O God. Put a new and right spirit within me. Friends, if you don't have that heart, guess what? Jesus has compassion for the heartless. There's another H for you. Don't feel guilty. Ask God to give you that heart. It's the business he's in. So we're going to have a time of ministry. Are we going to have a closing song? Is it part of the ministry today? Either during or after, I'm really not sure, sorry. We're going to have a time of ministry. If you feel like you just want that heart, come up and ask somebody to pray. God, give me a heart of compassion. Or if you feel like you're helpless right now and you need healing in some area of your life, come up and receive compassion. Or if you're praying for somebody and you feel it's hopeless, I've prayed for them for 50 years, and guess what? They're still far from the Lord. Friends, one word from Jesus, their eyes can be open. So whether it's you or somebody you're praying for, when we have a ministry time, come on forward. Come on forward.
Thank you, Bill. Stand up. We're going to sing the song of the vineyard. More love, more power. Ministry teams, come on up. Some of us are going to gather over Floyd, who had a traumatic event, been in the hospital, had neurosurgery. If you want to pray for him, you've got some words. We're going to go to Floyd. But as we sing, let's pray for each other. Here we go.
More love, more power,
More of you in my heart.
more of you in my life.
Sing that again. More love, more power.
More love, more power, more of you in my life.
And
I will worship you with all of my heart. I will worship you
all of my strength.
with all of my mind. I will worship you
all my mind.
with all of my strength. You are my Lord.
You are my Lord.
More love, more power, more of you in my life. More love, more power, more of you in my life. I will worship you with all of my heart. I will worship you with all of my mind. I will worship you with all of my strength. You are my Lord.
My Lord. You are my Lord. Let me ask you to do this. Would you open your heart right now and receive the heart of Jesus, of compassion, like Bill has spoken? So, Lord, this morning, fill our hearts with the compassion of God. Give us eyes to see people the way you see people. We open our minds and our hearts to look at people the way you do. Fill us, fill me with compassion, with mercy. I'm going to speak a blessing over you. We're going to stay up front and pray. Look around. You can pray for each other. You can come up. But I bless you to live this week with your eyes open, with your heart full of God's compassion, to do what Jesus did with all those H's. When you see an H, get the compassion of God. As God leads you, God bless you. You're dismissed.